Thanks very much, Rigo. Yeah, my name's Jonathan, and I'm here to talk about ISE as a common policy context hub. And I'm a technical marketing engineer here at Cisco. So as an agenda, I'm going to give an introduction to begin with and some use cases to hopefully make you aware of what this is covering. And one of the aspects of this with Identity Services Engine is to integrate with ACI. So initially, I'm going to talk about integrating with ACI and learning context from the ACI fabric into ISE. And then once we've learned that, I'm going to talk about what ISE does with this context. It can share it with multiple other domains, as well as sharing context back to ACI. So if ISE has the campus information and campus context, we can share that with the ACI domain as well. And with ISE 3.4 patch 1, we've been able to learn some workloads as well from the likes of cloud providers. So learning not just the IP address of these workloads, but all sorts of different attributes and assigning them into groups. So I'm going to talk about how that works. And then at the end, just some resources and documentation. So introduction and use cases then to begin with. And the product manager for this solution came up with a really good succinct definition of what common policy is. And let's read this together. So common policy is a framework for building and enforcing consistent access and segmentation policies, regardless of the domain. ISE Workload Connectors is part of that framework, allowing users to build connections with on-prem and cloud data centers, import application workload context, normalize that context into security group tags, and share the context with other domains for building policy. And I thought that was a good explanation. But it's really about providing this context so that admins in each domain can configure consistent security policies. And this is, again, a graphical representation of the need for this sort of solution. You know, Cisco are fortunate enough to have fingers in lots of pies. So software-defined access in the bottom left, and then going across to the right, you know, devices outside the fabric. So it could be non-fabric. These are different domains. And the top left, you know, we have our Meraki devices, Meraki domain, security with our firewalls and such like. Also, Cisco Secure Access, which is our SSE solution. Of course, we've got SD-WAN, we've got the data center with ACI, and top right, we have these external providers, cloud and external services. So all of these domains, you know, that we may want to configure security policy on. So how do you configure them in a consistent way? This is the challenge. So one of the integrations that we've really improved recently with part of this solution is the integration from ISE to ACI. And we have this integration to the APIC controller in an ACI fabric. And I think the main advantage or the main enhancement is that we're using pxgrid for this connection. We did years ago have an interconnection purely with API, but this is now using proper pxgrid, you know, context sharing mechanism. So APIC now is a pxgrid client, and we can do subscription and publication now with APIC. So that's really enhanced this integration. And what that's allowed is it's allowed us to connect to multiple APICs, multiple tenants, multiple VRFs, and multiple L3 outs in our ACI fabric. Now this has come about. We actually had a release of this in ISE 3.4 and in APIC 6.1.1, but this function was just limited availability at that point. But it has become generally available now. It was made available a few weeks ago, and this was in a patch 1 of ISE 3.4 and in 6.1.2 of APIC. So this is available to be used today. But it's a much better context sharing mechanism between ISE and ACI. And I've put at the top right there normalization. So what we're doing is we're normalizing groups. Of course, in the ACI, we have a group concept using endpoint groups and endpoint security groups, or EPGs and ESGs. And we can learn that into ISE, and ISE normalizes that into SGTs, security group tags. So that's what we use on the campus. And the other way is also true. We have SGTs on the campus side with ISE. We share that with APIC and ACI, and that becomes known actually as an external EPG. So it's about normalizing groups in both directions. As well as that, common policy, as I said, are using these external workload connectors, for example, to connect to cloud providers, AWS, Azure, GCP as examples. And this allows us to learn the IP addresses of these workloads, as well as different attributes. And we can use this information to create IP to group bindings or mappings. And with that information, we can then share that with other domains. Of course, we have connectivity to Catalyst Center using Identity Services Engine. So whatever groups we create or classify in ISE or learn from the ACI domain, we share that with Catalyst Center. So if that's where you're configuring your security policies, then the groups will be there for you to configure your policies and orchestrate your policies on your systems. Now, we also obviously have connectivity to our network devices. This is bread and butter for ISE. You know, this is where our endpoints and our users are all connecting and authenticating onto the network, and we're signing these endpoints and users into groups. But if we're sharing groups from ACI, we can share that down with our network devices so that we can enforce policy on our network devices, based off of context learned from ACI. And the similar from the cloud, if we're classifying cloud workloads, we can share that contact and that group information to our network devices and enforce for traffic destined towards the cloud. So this is the real advantage of being able to share this context to multiple domains. Now, we're not stopping there. We're also sharing this information with our SD-WAN constructs. So SD-WAN will know these groups and can enforce traffic actually within SD-WAN if you wanted to as well. We're also sharing with our SSE platform, our Cisco Secure Access, sharing the groups to that platform so you can enforce policies in there based off of the groups learned from other domains. And also Meraki Dashboard. Again, sharing this information to Meraki Dashboard so you can enforce perhaps in branches using Meraki devices using groups learned from other domains. So this is the real power of the solution. So some use cases then. Let's start on the bottom right. We have our on-prem data center here with ACI. And just to the left of that, we've got firewall devices. They may be front-ending the data center, for example, or anywhere else in your campus. And the top right there, we could have the internet or private public cloud. And for traffic entering private public cloud and internet, we may want to go through our Cisco Secure Access solution. And then on the left at the bottom, we could have branches and campuses with Meraki devices. We could have our software-defined access network with our Cat9Ks. And at the top, we could have SD-WAN as a transport. And typically, we can use SD-WAN as a transport from the campus through to Cisco Secure Access, and we can carry this policy information. So these are some of the use cases then. We could have users or things on an SD access network, traffic flowing up through SD-WAN, carrying policy through SD-WAN, through to Cisco Secure Access. That's one use case, going up to private public cloud or the internet. We may have users or things on SD access, perhaps not going through Cisco Secure Access, but going through to on-prem data centers, for example. Another one, users and things on Meraki devices. Again, perhaps going through Cisco Secure Access, going to the internet or private public cloud, and also devices from the branches going through perhaps the firewall device, with Firepower Management Center and FTD onto the on-prem data center. But what's great is that, as I said, we can classify cloud workloads into ISE and classify external workloads as well. It doesn't have to necessarily be in the cloud, VMware and such like, and classify them into groups and share them with ACI as we've got here, but also learning groups from ACI. And once we've got that information, we can share that information with our firewalls, with our Meraki dashboard, with our network devices. This is, for example, for our border devices on an SD-Access network. Share them with SD-WAN. Share the context, the groups, and the IP addresses with Cisco Secure Access. And what this allows us to do is configure security policy in these domains. So for the first use case, we might want to enforce traffic on the campus based off of information learned from other domains, for example, here. We might want to enforce on SD-WAN as we're carrying traffic through SD-WAN. We could enforce there, or enforce on the Cisco Secure Access platform based off of context learned from other domains. The next use case here is from SD-Access through to on-prem data center. We could enforce on that border device because we've learned the groups from ACI. We know what IP addresses are in those groups, and so we can enforce that on the border there in the campus, so based off of the information learned from the data center. Alternatively, we could enforce in the data center for this flow because we've shared that information of the campus to the data center. So you could have policy in there to say from employees, for example, to our data center destination enforce, and it knows about employees now because we've shared that with them on through ISE. Third use case, we could enforce on our Meraki devices because we're sharing this information to the Meraki dashboard, or you could enforce on Cisco Secure Access. And then the bottom use case, you can enforce on Meraki devices, on our firewalls, or in the data center. So these are just some examples, just allowing you to configure policy in each of these domains, but based off of consistent information. So firstly, then, I'm going to talk about integrating with ACI. And initially, when we make a connection to ACI, we learn information into ISE about the groups that we select. So when you make this connection, again, we are making this via PX Grid as a proper context sharing mechanism. But in ISE, you configure what the credentials you need in order to connect to APIC. It connects and it starts sharing information over the PX Grid bus. Then there's the group name normalization. Now you want to tell the system what names of groups you want to use. Now you can use, for example, an admin in ISE. If you're learning a group from ACI, why not put a prefix on that name, like just put ACI on the front of it, so that each of the groups in ISE, if you've got ACI on the front, you'll know that it's come from the ACI domain. So you can use a prefix, or you can use a suffix, or you can use any of these names or values or attributes from ACI. So you can use the connection name, tenant name, application profile, or VRF, or EPG, or ESG. You can use these attributes in the naming convention. And this is just to allow the ISE admin to see and know that it's actually come from ACI. So you can change the name accordingly, however you want to call the group when you've learned it from APIC into ISE. So you can use a prefix or a suffix if you want to. And this is where you choose the EPGs or ESGs in ACI. Which ones do you want to learn into ISE? It's a choice. You don't have to learn them all. And of course, there's a number which is associated with an SGT as well in ISE. And you can choose a range of numbers they want to use when you're importing in from the data center. So, for example, from 1000 to 1099, you might want to reserve for groups learnt from ACI. Now, when we're learning information in from ACI, and we're learning the IP to EPG bindings or the IP to ESG bindings, we need to put those bindings somewhere into ISE. And this allows us to segregate our bindings so that we can then control which bindings we send out to the different domains. And the way we do this is we create spaces within ISE to put these bindings. And these spaces are called SGT domains. So I just wanted to explain a little bit about SGT domains so that the configuration makes sense that's coming up. So in ISE then, we have these spaces or SGT domains which hold these IP to group bindings. And so there's a default domain, but you may create your own SGT domain A and B, imaginatively named here. So yeah, in ISE, you can add static bindings if you want, IP to group bindings, and you place them in the domain that you want to put them in. So this is putting it into the default domain, which is clear. You may add another IP to SGT binding and put them in different domains. Because they're segregated domains, you can have the same IP to SGT in multiple domains. And then when ISE is sending these out, if you had an SXP connection and it's a speaker on ISE sending down to a listener, you can define which domains you send down. So only the bindings in those domains get sent out of this speaker connection. And then in ISE, you have listeners. So you say if you've got a listener and you're listening to bindings coming in, then you can put them in whichever domain you want. This is an example of putting them into the default domain. And again, you have a speaker sending just the default domain bindings out to this network device. So you have these speakers and listeners. Now, dynamic bindings, by dynamic, I mean you've got users and endpoints connecting to the network, authenticating with ISE. ISE is assigning them into a group with an SGT. And this IP to SGT is placed into a domain. They are placed into the default domain by default, but you can use SSP filters to put them in whichever domains you wish. And also, we send these bindings out through PXGrid. As I said, we're using this PXGrid sharing mechanism. And this is what we call the PXGrid topic. So if a client wants to subscribe to the IP to SGT bindings, it can subscribe to this particular topic to receive these bindings. Now, what's new is that we have this external connector now, for example, connecting to cloud workloads, and we have this connector to ACI. So how does this work? Well, we have a new term called Inbound SGT Domain Rules, so that when we're classifying cloud workloads and learning the EPGs and ESG to IP bindings, we have inbound rules to say which domains do we want to place these learnt bindings into. So that's what an inbound rule is. It's just putting those bindings into particular domains. And on the ACI front, we also have SGT domain outbound rules. So we've got these bindings. Which domain do we want to send bindings to the ACI fabric? So that's what's fairly new about this. We have these inbound rules and outbound rules, but it's just making use of these SGT domains. Domains have been around for a long time. They used to be called SXP domains, but they're called SGT domains now, but it's the same concept. So that's where this comes in, where we're having this inbound domain rule in ISE. So if we're connecting to ACI, then which SGT domain do we want to bring bindings into? This is part of the configuration in our inbound rule. We give it a name, and then we say, what is the destination? When we're bringing them in, what is the SGT domain we want to bring these bindings into? In this case, I've just set the employee domain. And what is the conditions or the rules for this? So I've just said the source is from this APIC connection. I'm going to bring in bindings from the tenant called demo. And I'm going to say the EPG I want to bring in is called Demo Web EPG. And also I'm going to bring in an EPG called Demo Client EPG. So this is what I'm bringing into ISE. So I'm going to go on to a demo then. We've got Identity Services Engine in the middle here. And of course, the demo is showing learning context from APIC. I'm also going to show what that means in Catalyst Center in terms of sharing the groups with our network devices, and also sharing with Meraki Dashboard. That's what this demo is going to show. So on APIC then, we've got this new integrations menu, which is really nice. We can choose the particular ISE integration that we've got from this APIC. And we can look at the connection details. Now here, it shows that we were using PX Grid. So that's something that's new. And APIC here is a publisher. It's just publishing into ISE at this particular moment in time. It will be a subscriber later on. Now, if we look at the endpoints here, we haven't got any SGTs. We haven't learned anything from the campus yet. But what we're doing is we're sharing the ACI groups out, the client EPG and web EPG, and the IP address memberships as well. So in Identity Services Engine, this was configured under TrustSec integrations. And here we've got an overview of our workload connectors. And these are our connections. And what we're talking about here is this connection here, the connection to ACI. So it's up and in place. I have configured it. And we're learning these two groups that we configured. That was the web EPG and the client EPG. Now we can click on this number 2 and we can see there are 2 SGT bindings learned here. You can see 10.1.1.126 and 10.2.2.1.27. These are the IP memberships of these 2 groups that we've learned from ACI. They've been learned as SGTs in ISE, so we've normalized them. They're for use in ISE, but they're actually from the data center. So these are the IP to SGTs learned from APIC or from the data center. So again, this is the ACI connection. So if I click on it, just show you how I configured it. It's just got some credentials there. It's also got learned the IPs of the 3 APICs in the APIC cluster, and it uses that for high availability. This is the name conversion I was talking about, where you could have a prefix or suffix to change the name of groups learned into ISE. You can see there it's got, you can use the ACI attribute values if you want. So if you want to use the VRF name in your name in ISE, alternatively, just use the, the append the prefix or the suffix. And that's what I've got. I've got a prefix of ACI in this example. And that's just to allow the admin in ISE to pretty much know where it's come from ACI. These are the 2 EPGs and ESGs I've selected to be synced over. So the demo client EPG and web EPG, and this is the numbering range. So in ISE, we've got SGT numbers, and I've set 3000 to 4000. So that's the connectivity. And under SXP, we see the bindings under the SGT bindings. So again, this is the IP to EPGs I've learned, and they've been learned in ISE as IP to SGTs. I was looking here for the actual SGT number, but it's the number here. If I just expand that column, you can see the SGT numbers there have started from 3000 as set, so 3000 and 3001. Now, what does this mean in Catalyst Center? So this is Catalyst Center. We go to Policy, Based Access Control, and let's have a look at our security groups. And here at the top, you see immediately we've got the groups we've learned. So these are groups learned from the data center into ISE, and ISE has shared that with Catalyst Center. And if we go to our policies, you can see they're in our policy matrix. So we've got demo client EPG and demo web EPG. So this allows us to build our policies using Catalyst Center, from any group to any of those learned from the data center, or from those groups to anything else in the campus. So this is the context in the campus domain based off of what's learned from the data center. And this is on our 9500, it's an SD access border. So if I just have a look to see what's available on our SD access border here, you can see these groups, 3000 and 3001, client EPG and web EPG. We've learned these groups in ISE, and we've sent them down to our network devices. Once on the network device, we can see if they're the IP address memberships of these groups. So if we have a look at the SGT mappings, we can see here at the top, we've learned the memberships of these groups on the data center as well, 10.1.1.26 and 10.2.2.1.27. So we've not just learned the groups from ACI, we've learned the IP address memberships. And because this is on the switch, we can then enforce on this switch a traffic destined towards the data center, for example. So if we had a look at the policy, remember the policy is downloaded dynamically. As soon as this border or a network access device learns of an IP to SGT to protect, it will download the policy dynamically. And you can see at the bottom there, we've got guests to the demo web EPG and developers to the demo web EPG. These are downloaded dynamically, so we can enforce on this border for traffic from the fabric going towards the data center even before it exits the border. So this is the power of sharing context between these different domains. Now let's have a look at, going back to Identity Services Engine, under integrations, we also have an integration with Meraki Dashboard. So there's an overview here. And then if we look at our connections, now I have a connection to my Meraki Dashboard as well. So if we look at the sync selections, I can sync over SGTs I want, the policies I want, and the SGACLs or the contracts I want. So you select what you want to sync over. So I've got some policies here, including the demo client EPG, which is the group learned from the data center. And you can see the groups that I'm sharing. So with policies and the groups. So you can see I'm sharing the learned group from the data center over to the Meraki dashboard. And looking at the sync status, you see that it's, what has been synced, the groups, the policies, and the SGACLs that have been synced over to the dashboard. So going over to the dashboard then, under the org, you can look at the adaptive policy. And here we've got our groups. And if I scroll down, you see the two groups there, learned from the data center through ISE, shared to the Meraki dashboard. And we've also got our policies here. So we've got up to the top. The policy looks like this in the Meraki dashboard. It's a matrix within Identity Services Engine and in Catalyst Center. But you can see here we have policies using the groups from the data center. So hopefully that started to make it a bit clear about why we're sharing this information to these different domains. So I showed it in Catalyst Center. I've showed them in the CLI of a border on the SD Access Fabric, and also in the Meraki dashboard. So let's talk about sending this data back to ACI. We've talked about learning from ACI and sharing it to other domains. What about sharing with ACI as well? Well, in this case, we configure an outbound rule because we want to control what we send to ACI. We might not want to share everything. So the first thing we do is that we choose which ACI connection we want to share context with, because you may have multiple data centers, for example. And then it allows you to select the actual L3 out interface on your ACI fabric, because you could share to multiples. And then you configure, again, the meat of this rule. So you say, from which SXP or SGT domains do you want to share these bindings? So that's why I was talking about SGT domains before. So which domains do we want to share bindings from? So I've chosen employees there at the top. And then which SGT do you want to share? And I've also shared the employees SGT. Now, what is really nice is that when we're sharing this information, what we can do is we can send a message to APIC and bring back the contracts which are available on that L3 out. So it's telling us here for the employees, if I send the employees SGT, these contracts are available. For example, the campus to web contract in the bottom right of the screen. And this allows us to automatically connect to this contract when we send the group over. So what this alleviates is that if you add a group and we send it over to APIC, you don't then need to go over to the APIC UI in order to connect it to a contract. You can do it straight from the ISE UI. So you can select it and submit. So as I said, this is what it allows. If you add this new group, SGT4's employees, for example, if you connected it to an existing contract, the campus to web on the right-hand side, it automatically connects you as a new provider to that contract so that traffic flows immediately. So I think that's a nice touch. So let's have a look at this as a demo then. So this is just going to be ISE sending context out to APIC. So let's have a look at APIC, have a look at the tenant. My tenant's called demo here. And under networking, we have our L3 out interfaces. Mine's called campus 1, L3 out. And we have our external EPGs. All I've got there at the moment is whole campus. It's everything coming in from the campus. You can't get any more granular if you're building your policies. You can't get granular to employees, contractors, guests, or what have you. That's all you've got to work on at the initial stage of this integration. Also going up to application profiles. And if I click here and have a look at the topology of our contracts, just very simply, I've got everything coming in from the whole campus, the L3, up to the campus to web contract, and then being consumed by other EPGs in the network. So it's very simple contract I've got right now, acting on anything coming in from the campus. So let's go back to Identity Services Engine. Oh, firstly, I want to show you this integrations menu. This is a new menu in 6.1.1. And if we select the actual ISE connection that we've got, and the connection details, already showed you before, it's connected with pxgrid. This is just showing that it's a publisher right now. As soon as we add and push groups in an outbound rule to APIC, you'll see that then APIC is then subscribing to those groups. We'll see that in a minute. And there's no SGTs learned just yet before we submit our configuration in ISE. So let's go back to ISE and let's have a look at our rules here. So this is our outbound SGT domain rules. So we don't have one yet. We're not sending anything to APIC just yet. So let's create an outbound rule, give it a meaningful name. So where do we want to send this new context? So we obviously want to send it to ACI. So I'll select my ACI connection. And it asks me for which L3 out, because we could have multiples. So I'm going to select the campus 1 L3 out here. And then you configure your conditions. So I'm going to say, what do I want to send over? Well, I'm going to send over some bindings that I've got in a particular SGT domain. So let's say SGT domain. I'm going to send over the bindings in the default domain. And now the SGT name itself, I'm going to send over the employees SGT, and you can send multiples. So I'll say I'll send finance as well. And as soon as you do that, that bottom bit drops out, which allows you to connect to existing contracts in APIC related to the L3 out. So let's choose a new provided contract. So employees or finance. You could obviously choose both, but as an example, I'll choose one. So I'll choose this contract here, the campus to web. And let's add and save it. So that's our outbound rule. So let's have a look to see what effect that has had over in APIC. So let's go to the tenants and the demo tenant under networking, L3 outs. Let's go down to our external EPGs. And you see here, SGT4 is employees and SGT16 is finance. The names will appear there in a recent release, in a more recent release. So these are the new groups that have come in. So now when we build our contracts, we can be much more granular with what we want to build our policies on. And here are now the SGT endpoints which have been learnt. Not just the employees SGT, but the IP addresses of those, the IP memberships. And looking at the topology, you can see here, we've got now not just the whole campus coming in, we've got this SGT, this new group that's been learnt, we've attached it to the existing campus to web contract, which allowed traffic to flow immediately. So that's what I said before, is a really nice touch where you don't have to jump into the APIC UI in order to add the contract. You can do it straight from the ISE UI. So that's sharing information to ACI. Yeah, just showing a bit more information using the integrations tab. You can see now APIC there is a subscriber, is subscribing to those groups as well as publishing its own on that PX grid topic. And now it's got these SGTs, both employees and finance that have been learnt from ISE. So it's normalizing groups, it's sharing these contexts. You see these SGT bindings here in ISE. This is what we've been sharing: the employees IP to SGTs and the finance IP to SGTs. These are the ones that we've shared over to APIC. Of course, we're not just having this connection with ACI. We've also got this external connector, and we can learn the likes of cloud workloads using AWS as an example. So how does this work? Well, we've got our workloads on the left there from AWS, and in ISE we can choose what external connector we want to learn context from. So at the top there I've chosen AWS, and there's all sorts of workload attributes for each workload in AWS. For example, you could have version, OS, location, and so on, and you can create your own tags. But the first bit in ISE is to say, which attributes do I actually want to use in my policy? So I could use the name, I could use an application name, the location, or what have you, and we can use them in ISE to build our policies. And what the policy is that we want to really classify these workloads. So we want to learn the IP address, and using the attributes, we want to use them to associate the learn IP address of a workload to a group. So it may be finance, it may be whatever you want to classify it to, and then share them out of PX Grid to other domains, out of SXP to our network devices, for example. And this is the first time we've come across in this talk about the secondary SGT. This is the first time we're getting into the realm of assigning not just one SGT per endpoint or user, but multiple. So we're using the secondary SGT term here as well. So classification rules then we have So we obviously have a name of a classification rule, and from this rule, excuse me, we want to assign a primary SGT. In this case, this example here, I've got PCI servers, and optionally you can assign a secondary SGT. And these are our conditions. So the top two rows here are related to learning from an external connector, let's say AWS, for example. So I've got there the source, is from AWS, and I've used a condition of owner has a particular name. So this is about classifying workloads from AWS and assigning them this SGT. But optionally, you can also have a classification rule for ACI. Now, you might think that's a bit strange because with ACI, we're already learning the group. We're learning the EPG or ESG and normalizing that into an SGT. Yes, we are. So that group, the EPG or ESG, is what we put into the primary SGT. So we use a classification rule for ACI if we want to optionally assign a secondary SGT. That's the point of that. And there may be some questions on primary and secondary SGT, but the primary SGT is what we've always used as SGT. We've sent that out through pxgrid as a security, and we've sent it out through SXP. It's the secondary SGT, which is the new concept here, but we share that as an additional entry in the session topic, and it's sent as an array, and it's an array because you can have more than one secondary, and it's sent as the secondary security groups. So let's have an example then and a demo of classifying from AWS. So we're going to classify using these workload connectors. We're going to be able to share that with APIC. It's about sharing to multiple domains. And I'm also going to show sharing to CLI, again, to the 9500 border. So in AWS then, we've got our EC2 instances. I've got 3 of them running here. And you can see on the right-hand side, the IP addresses we're looking at here, 380, 389, 34, and the private is 172. So just roughly remember those IP addresses. But each of these workloads has some tags here. So I've got some tags, name, application, location, contact, and so on. But have a look at the application here. It's got finance PCI. I've got finance in the name of the application. And I've got finance in each of these attributes in all 3 of these workloads. You can see here the application is finance-pay. And then in the tax services machine under tags here, I've got application is finance-tax. So to classify these all these 3, I could just use the fact that the term finance is in application and then classify all 3 into the same group, should that be something that you wanted to do. So in Identity Services Engine then, under integrations, again under workload connections, I've got this ISE to AWS connection. We got the connection up and running. I click on it. I've just configured the secret and everything and connected to the AWS provider. You see, I haven't got any bindings there yet because I haven't classified anything yet. So when we have this connection that we make to AWS, we bring back all the attributes of the workloads, and you can choose which attributes you want to use in your policy. So one of them is the application there that I said that has the finance term. You may want to use contact at some point, name and locations. This is how you set which ones you want to use in your policies. And then we can move on to our workload classification, the actual classification using those attributes to assign SGTs. And we do that. Let's have a look at our SGT bindings to begin with. So we haven't got any of those IP addresses, if you remember them, from AWS just yet. So we haven't got any classification. And these are the IP addresses, 380, 389, 34, and 172. So just very roughly remember those numbers, those IPs. So let's classify. So under integrations then, Again, we've got our connection. It's up and running. We've got our attributes that we said we wanted to use in our policy. So this is our classification rule. So let's give the rule name a name that's meaningful. And this is the primary SGT we want to assign. So let's assign the finance SGT, because I want to bundle them all into a finance group. And again, optionally, you can configure a secondary SGT. So here, let's say that these are in production. So I may assign a different SGT, an additional SGT. Let's say, let's scroll down again and choose production servers. So what are the conditions here? Let's say the source I want to classify from my AWS connection. So this is my AWS connection. And now in here, this is what we set as an learned attribute from AWS. These are what we can use in our policy. And remember, we had one of them was application. And we could say, right, application contains finance. Remember, all three of them had the term finance in their attribute value. So we can add and save this into ISE. This should be classifying these VMs, these workloads in AWS. And this does take 10 seconds or so. So I'll refresh this a couple of times. But remember, it's going to the cloud, AWS in this instance, looking at all the VMs, all the attributes coming down. It's learning the IP addresses of those workloads and using the classification rule to map, using those attributes, map that into an IP to SGT bindings. That's what it's doing. And in this case, I've got 3 workloads. I'm putting them all into the finance group and also giving it a secondary SGT, bearing in mind that there are no consumers of secondary SGT just yet. We've made it possible, but hopefully firewalls and that will get up to speed and we'll be able to make use of the secondary SGT. So now going into our bindings, if you roughly remember the IP addresses, 380, 383, and at the bottom, the 172s, we've learned the IP address, we've used a classification rule to put those IP addresses in a particular group. So you see that there are 6 entries here because of the 6 IPs from the cloud. And because ISE has these IP to group bindings now, we can share them with ACI, for example. Here they are, automatically coming up in ACI. We've got the 172s, the 34s. So it's a dynamic technology, learning from one domain, automatically sharing them with another, and being able to enforce an ACI should you wish to here, because it has the context learnt from the cloud. Also going over to CLI, again, we're on our 9500 border, just using that as an example. If we have a look at our SGT bindings, so our SGT mappings here, again, just very roughly remembering the IP addresses, we're mapping these into the finance group. The group here is group number 16. So we've got all those IP addresses. So ISE learning from the cloud was automatically sending out to network devices. And as soon as the network devices knows it has this SGT to protect, this finance 16, it should download a policy dynamically. So if we have a look at the role-based permissions, we've got some permissions in here. Yeah, there's guests to group 16 finance, for example, and point of sale systems to group finance, and PCI servers to group finance. So we can enforce on this network device based off of classification we've done from the cloud. So this is the power of sharing the context to different domains and being able to enforce where it makes sense and wherever it makes sense in your network. Now, I've shown some examples here of CLI, Meraki Dashboard, ACI, but equally it's the same looking at FMC, for example, of our firewalls. We're also sharing with Cisco Secure Access, and also SD-WAN, being able to configure consistent policies whichever domain you're on. So that concludes the presentation. Just wanted to again make sure you're aware of our Iceberg website. It's something that Thomas done a great job on getting this together. You can just put hash with a term that you're looking for, and it jumps to it straight away. So have a look at that page. So I've got the CSCO ISE Dashboard at the top right, and there's other links that I've got here as well. A whole host of information on Identity Services Engine. Really encourage you to have a look around at the resources. This feature for common policy came out in ISE 3.4, particularly with ISE 3.4 patch 1. So here there are some notes for you for release notes, the guides, and so on, and also some other related documents for common policy and TrustSec with SGTs. So that concludes the presentation. I hope you found it useful.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Really appreciate that awesome presentation. Before we wrap up the session for today, I did just want to take a moment to address one outstanding question from our audience, if that's okay with you, Jonathan. That question was, when the EPG is normalized, does it carry the tenant name and all that stuff that used to carry when we had the ACI endpoint update app? Hopefully that makes sense. I can happy to reread it.
Okay. Well, I can talk about the name for sure. So yeah, when ISE connects to ACI, the names are kept from ISE into APIC. So if you've got something like employees and you send it across, I showed you the menu and it just showed SGT4. But in other UIs in APIC, it does show the SGT name of employees. So you will see that in APIC. And in the other direction, if you like, my example was client EPG, for example. When you make your connection, you define what normalization name you want to use. So you could put a suffix on that name you learn. So you do learn the name into ISE, but you just change it to how you want to see it. So you can put a suffix or a prefix on it, or use like click the VRF and you can use the VRF in the name if you want. So yeah, the names are shared in both directions. It's just that in ISE you can change it should you want to.